Okay, great. Hey, hello, everyone, to the first episode of Disagreed, the new podcast being brought to you by Fundamental. In case you haven't heard about us, don't fret. That's why the podcast is here, and we're going to walk you over the next 365 days a little bit through our thinking about the global construction tech markets. With me, I have my partner Shub, and both of us are investors within the Fundamental team. The whole idea of Disagreed is, as you could imagine, really disagree strongly on what we expect to see in construction tech. And every episode we pick a topic and we'll dissect that topic from multiple angles. And typically we disagree like a really wonky old couple. So I think, stay tuned for that one. So Shub, I guess we can start right in. Topic for today's number one inaugural episode is whether warehousing is going to be the next big opportunity in construction. And is that an opportunity hidden in plain sight? So you and I, we have agreed a little bit on battle rules for this Disagreed episode one. And essentially for the viewers out there, we will have a look at four questions to find out whether warehousing is the next big opportunity in construction and construction technology. So, Shub, what do you say? Should we kick it off with the first question?
Let's do it. Very excited to jamming with you, Patrick, and winning as well.
Ah, yes, I'm sure you do. And as always, very humble, sir. It's going to be fun.
Thank you.
So, Shub, I think you were the sponsor of the first question. So, I'll give you the courtesy of reading your own question back to you, which is: so much venture funding has already gone into logistics and road freight. Can warehousing ever be as large as the market opportunity has proven to be in road freight? So, round one, over to you.
Awesome. So it is a very tricky and a bold, question and a statement to make in multiple ways. Because quite literally, as you said, Patrick, so much money has gone into road freight and various other categories in logistics. By my estimates and research, upwards of $5-6 billion went into those categories last year in road freight and a few other categories in logistics. Depending on, I guess, how you slice the market, could be anywhere from 20 to as many as 50 unicorns in this space as well, which is a pretty staggering number when you think about it. The other thing that makes it hard is, depending on the definition, warehouse is a slice within logistics. So in some ways, it boosts the overall logistics ecosystem. What I would argue that warehouse very much is the next big opportunity waiting to be tapped by investors in logistics. But it needs to work in sync with certain models that exist and certain other models that are evolving at this point. So very much excited. It is indeed the next big opportunity.
So I don't know if you guys can hear that, but I think on my side somebody is doing actual construction work. So in case you hear some hammering, this is not artificial for the show. It's actually really happening. But to go back to what you are saying, Shub, I have a few numbers that corroborate what you are saying as well. So logistics has raised more than 100 billion in venture funding to date, warehousing about 10 billion. Yeah, so that's right now a 10x on the logistics and road freight side. But I'm going to make more of an argument why warehousing will catch up from a more market progression standpoint. And the more complex and fast-moving our supply chains get, the more volatility you will also get, and the more you either need more digital integration or more warehousing to deal with that volatility, complexity, and speed. And when you look at even the most successful freight forwarders, let's say Sender, Convoy, Blackbuck, and multiple other companies that are hugely successful, even they aren't at a level of digital integration that is able to deal with every and any complexity in the supply chain. So I think digital integration in and of itself will never be able to entirely solve the volatility that we get from our complex supply chains and the fast-moving supply chains. So if you believe in that argument, I think warehousing is the only way how you can buffer in order to reduce the volatility. And then when you look at the construction marketplaces and the construction ecosystem, there's currently no way how anyone has actually integrated to the degree Sender has from the digital side, as well as construction projects are really an organic and a dynamic piece in and of itself. So for me, that's one of the key reasons why I believe warehousing is one of the key things to drive out volatility out of construction projects.
I mean, look, I can't really disagree. I think we agree on quite a few things, but maybe some meaningful differentiators. What I will throw in there is for all the discussion around integration, there are, I would argue, there is a fresh wave of demand for new kinds of solutions which provide continuity at the last mile. Especially because so many supply chains have become even more dependent on being available in real time in a post-COVID world. When the supply chains you relied on in the past are perhaps not as available as you thought so before. I think the form I expect or I imagine it will take, especially for construction supply chains, is working hand in hand with the last mile. The last mile both in terms of logistics as well as the last mile in terms of point of access for materials and services. In my opinion, that could be a very exciting new wave altogether to innovate in logistics from a warehousing first perspective or a embedded warehousing solution, if that makes any sense, which is very different from how, let's say, road freight firms have approached logistics innovation so far.
Yeah, and I think there's a King Kong out there that kind of proves your argument. So I'm viciously agreeing with you, not disagreeing. We'll come to that later in this episode. But Amazon is the King Kong on the block in e-commerce, right? And so when you dissect Amazon and what gives them a ton of market power, I would argue it's three functions, right? It's the customer front end and the whole funnel that they've built. Some people would argue it's the logistics because that was one of the core functions that they built really early in Amazon. And I would argue it's actually the warehousing. And one thing I wonder is, so if you strip Amazon from the customer funnel, obviously Amazon loses a lot of power. So nobody would disagree with that. But if you compare their logistics prowess of having their own fleet of planes, of having their own last mile delivery, if you compare that prowess to Amazon operating their own warehouses, I would argue if you strip them of the warehouses, the impact on Amazon would actually be bigger than if you strip them of the logistics. And the reason is, if you get rid of the warehouses in Amazon, the time to deliver or the time to fulfill a customer order might actually inflate by as much as 4 to 7 days, simply because they have to ship the goods from multiple parts of the planet to achieve fulfillment. If you strip them from the logistics, they might only be a day or two later because they could still use third-party logistics, but they can't really use much of the third-party warehouses to the efficiency that Amazon has built it. So for me, that's one of the reasons why I think warehousing actually is a huge power play to build market power. And probably, similarly, we could see it for construction tech. Okay, so I think, Shub, agreeing viciously, let's maybe come more to a question where we might have a little bit more disagreement here. So moving to our next question with regard to warehousing and construction. Shub, does the construction industry need its own vertical focused warehousing solution, or could it be something where multi-industry generic warehousing solutions can also succeed in construction? What do you think?
So I think the construction industry needs a warehousing solution different from the industry norm or the more popular definition of warehouses today. But does that necessarily need to stand or be bespoke or specialized exclusively for construction? I would say not necessarily. And let me explain. So I think while the traditional model of large warehouses, typically outside the city, not too numerous, connecting cities, acting as nodes for a larger market, work very well for certain kinds of goods and consumption patterns. For construction materials, which are more long tail driven, both on goods and services, it is perhaps not the most efficient, especially in more crowded markets, or let's say markets with greater density of population, traffic concerns, etc. So it needs perhaps a more decentralized method or decentralized reimagination of what warehousing even means, which, for example, I would think mini micro depots, kind of a model where materials are, you have one warehouse decentralized in 10, maybe even 100 mini warehouses. Now, while that serves the purpose for fulfilling construction-related problems, hypothetically, one could argue it would also fit in for fresh produce, maybe, or other industries which are much more long tail in nature, where brands are missing and things of that sort. So I would say construction needs its own model, but need not be industry specific.
So I haven't thought about it that way. I've looked at it in a slightly different way. So one of the things I noticed is whenever somebody thinks of warehouses, we think of warehouses as a service to the sellers or a service to the suppliers. But what if we think of warehouses in a construction context as a service to the customers, meaning general contractors, right? So I see warehouse in construction tech more as a depot and a buffer that helps the general contractors to place stuff that they ordered, but maybe they haven't everything perfectly synced on their construction site and they don't want the stuff laying around on the construction site, but instead use that depot, that warehouse as a buffer from which they can then later order the last mile fulfillment to their construction site. And so when I think of the warehousing opportunity in construction and the construction tech, that's exactly what I have in mind, is a company that has depots around major cities within 10, 20 miles of every major construction site in a city, right? And from that depot being able to fulfill the general contractor when he or she uses an app and says, hey, tomorrow with a lead time of 24 hours, I will need that order fulfilled. I know it's already in my depot. Please bring it to my site tomorrow. And that's how I'm seeing it play out in construction.
It is interesting that you say this. Obviously, depending on the market and depending on the products and categories covered, I would indeed agree with you. There is enough opportunity for such an opportunity, for such a depot model to be exclusively tailored to building materials and supplies. I wonder if, for example, if the model evolves to the extent where it's a more milk run type model, for instance, where you really optimize your routes to the extent where you maximize number of deliveries per order. Would it make sense to perhaps throw in a few other different product categories on the same route, as long as the materials don't go well? Obviously, you don't want to mix food products with chemicals, for instance. That's not a great combination to be transporting simultaneously. But as long as there's no dependencies as such, I wonder if it is actually in the interest of the construction customer, the end customer, to not be exclusive, be okay with sharing the load, if you will, and therefore driving the cost down further and benefiting from the cost benefits.
Hey, let me challenge you on that, because I think the lever that you would have through the milk run model is on the last mile or intra-city logistics costs. That is something you could drive down. However, you might also have to have a much more complex warehouse operation. So the reason why I use the word depot is, if you think of the generic warehouses for pick and pack, they are massively automated warehouses nowadays, right? And that's because they are obviously optimized to generate a huge throughput and to be able to fulfill thousands and thousands of orders in a very short time frame. I don't see that necessarily in this opportunity to be the key driving force. What I see is the buffering ability, and I think the value comes from the space, from the location, and from a really easy online interface with which the general contractor could request the fulfillment. Now, if you see it that way, I don't think you need a ton of CapEx to automate the depot or the warehousing operation. So for me, the simplicity of not having to drive automation in the warehouses would actually ought to drive costs down. And I could imagine that you could even live with a little bit higher cost in the intra-city fulfillment if you can save millions of CapEx on the warehousing automation in the first place. So that's something I think is also unique about construction opportunity about warehouses. Hey Shub, we're moving on here to the third question. So for our viewers again, we're talking about warehouses in construction and will they be the big next opportunity? And more specifically, Shub, we were wondering, do we expect proven leaders from the road freight or even from the shipping space to also end up as the winners in the warehousing game in construction, or do you think there will be more focused winners for the warehousing in construction?
So before I give my answer, I must point out there is a very notable exception that completely disproves my answer, which is a firm that we have grown to admire a great deal called Versix over in Indonesia, which simultaneously happens to be a leader both in road freight and multimodal freight for that matter, as well as warehousing. Now, with the exception of Versix aside, I would say for in most markets and for most road freight players, it is quite a challenging problem statement to simultaneously win the road freight market as well as the warehousing solution as well. And I know sometimes we forget just how complex these problems are, how difficult it is to optimize routes, optimize the long tail of truck owners against where the demand is. I would imagine it would take someone achieving a scale comparable to an Amazon, and we discussed that example earlier, to have the available resources and the available data to optimize, where it makes sense for the leader to dominate both niches. At this point, I'm inclined to say, however, that since the established road freight leaders have seemingly learned a thing or two about road freight, but perhaps not as much about the downstream warehousing, that opportunity exists, and there is very much room for new players to specialize and win that market.
So I think I'm mostly in agreement, but I will caveat it that I think the argument you are making might work in a domestic only context. So where the supplier, seller, the logistics, and the customer are in the same country. And Indonesia is obviously, which is where Versix is, a really interesting market because it is just so unique. But let's also briefly consider, and that's where I want to challenge you, what about a cross-border scenario for construction tech, where the supplier and the seller of a good is, for example, in Asia, and the procurer is, for example, in North America or in Europe. So in that scenario, I wonder, where's really the value? Is the value in having the interface to the supplier, to the customer? Is the value in having the logistics or the warehouse? And I would argue that in such a cross-border scenario, the access to the supplier, as well as the access to the customer, and the ability to buffer the long distance as well as the temporal the long physical distance as well as the temporal distance, that's where the value is, if you are able to buffer that. And so in that, I wonder if I'm Maersk, if I'm DHL, if I'm Prologis, if I'm Goodman, and I already have access to those supply markets, plus I have a presence in the other demand markets, US or Europe for that matter. If I go now and expand my logistics game into building warehouses in those demand markets, I wonder whether I could really build an outsized company in that space from a cross-border construction materials perspective.
It's a very good question. I guess it quite often boils down to, if you have the opportunity, I guess, to put the marginal dollar, would you, and let's say I'm answering this question from the perspective of indeed a DHL or a Maersk or a Prologis, as you pointed out, would I use that marginal dollar to preserve and maybe enhance my chances against the likes of Sender and Black Buck, Convoy, right, Full Truck Alliance? Or would I continue to leave that flank exposed and try my hand at warehousing, which I most certainly cannot claim to be an expert at that domain, and I'm not the best person to answer that question. But I would argue it might be in their interest to preserve the core business rather than, I guess, start yet another expansive line of business, which may or may not prove out that effectively.
Right, and today, I mean, to be fair, they are always multi-vertical. It's not like they are construction focused, right? And so I guess that's where the argument could break a little bit. And if I'm a venture, I would probably build out the customer interface really, really well. Coming back to my argument about, hey, warehousing construction could maybe more be a depot, which is lowly automated but has an awesome online interface for contractors to order the last mile fulfillment rather than a fully automated pick and pack operation. So if that were to be true, actually the customer interface might be very, very relevant. And that's not necessarily something that a global logistics player today would be, investing in too much, I guess. So I don't know how you see it, but for me at least, a venture-backable founder who could build a cross-border solution using warehousing to buffer and basically deliver the last mile just in time, I would find that extremely valuable. And we have European clients in our network that are saying that, hey, ordering actually construction components from Asia at a norm, at standards that we do, and 50% lower cost is something that they are very actively looking at. And I think that's an underserved space to fulfill that cross-border.
I mean, I can hardly disagree with you. Buffering mechanism for cross-border would be quite the value add.
Yeah, I'm glad the show is called Disagreed, though. So, episode 1, we're still getting in the swing here. But good to see we also have some harmony. So, Shub, let's move on to the fourth question with regard to warehousing and construction. So more from an automation perspective, what do you think? Will the warehousing robotics space that we have seen already through other, reputed companies such as Kiva, GreyOrange, Geek Plus, will construction warehousing also be driven by ventures that come from the automation angle? Or if not, what actually will unlock the value in construction warehousing?
So I might come across as a bit of a non-believer in technology with this answer. But unfortunately, I can't really get excited, to be honest, about that much automation, or for that matter, any automation going too far in warehousing for construction. I would go so far as to say a very smart usage of project management skills and spreadsheets that are well maintained, but with up-to-date information and stakeholder management, that will go much, much, much further, given just how long tail both the demand and quite often the supply is. Managing all these various touch points, that is where I see the value being added. I think automation may be trying to codify things which are not yet ready to be codified. Maybe sometime in the future, but not for the next few years, I'm afraid, in my opinion.
So I'm in disagreement with you in that I think automation can drive value in construction in general. In the warehousing space, I'm not so sure it's economically feasible. And here's why. So if you think about what kinds of categories you would actually have to store in a construction warehouse and fulfill last mile, I could think of 3 categories. There's bulky stuff that is not being able to put on pallets. For example, steel, timber, yellow machines, aggregates, or windows, right? Then you have, secondly, bulky stuff that you can put on pallets, right? That's cement, drywall, roof shingles, hardwood floors, insulation. And then thirdly, you have handheld stuff, right? So it could be handheld power tools, electrical components, nails, screws, right? So you have these 3 categories that you could fulfill. Every one of them needs a different handling, right? You can't build one pick and pack system, in my mind, that is able to handle aggregates that are not on a pallet in the same way that you would handle a power tool that you could put in a bag, in the same way that you could put a pallet that has drywall on it. So if you want to drive value through automation in a warehouse for construction, you would have to have an even more sophisticated automation scheme than you would have to have in a pick and pack scenario. So for me, that doesn't feel like the way to drive much value initially out of the warehousing opportunity.
I wonder though if, because, for I guess the, counter opinionists out there, since both of us seem to be in agreement or broadly at least in some shape or form having a consensus here, clearly automation has been a big theme chased by the likes of Amazon and many other larger e-commerce players. I wonder if there could be a different imagining of a centralized platform of sorts, which at a certain scale and operating in a way comparable to Amazon could start seeing automation benefits. I must confess, notwithstanding what I'm saying here, I do think it is still quite far from reality, but I wonder if there may be such a case for excited entrepreneurs out there.
I mean, look, if you were focusing on one of the three categories, I guess you could get away with having an automation for that category. But what would be the value of a warehouse? I mean, the ultimate nature of a construction site is that you actually need multiple types of materials in order to fulfill a building. Now, we're not at the level of standardization of construction where we need to be. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, that there's a new category of buildings emerging within construction that are extremely well normed and standardized, which is, some of the digital general contractors that we see out there are going there, right? And over time, over iterations, you were able to drive down the number of components and the number of screws, nails, whatever that you need by 10x, okay? So even in that scenario, you will still need bulky, non-palatable stuff, steel, for example, or timber, and you will need the handheld stuff, which you could pick and pack, and you will need stuff on pallets. And so what would be the value, even in that very advanced scenario, what would be the value of a warehouse that is only able to handle one of the three types of categories in a highly automated way? I am not so sure. Maybe you could build a warehouse in which you could automate the handheld stuff and non-automate the other ones. I guess that's a way how, as a founder, I would look at it. But promising to automate all three of them in the same operation, that could be a difficult undertaking.
Yeah, I mean, the one opportunity I would imagine is only at maybe a large OEM's end, but that I think we're straying quite far from the warehousing proposition to begin with.
Right.
That's not really the spirit of warehousing opportunity.
Hey, so in wrapping up here, when you think about the warehousing opportunity in construction, we all seem to be agreeing that there's a real opportunity there. In your mind, what will an exciting company look like? Real quick.
So in my mind, and especially in the post-COVID world, what the construction ecosystem is going towards is empowering the last mile, the small suppliers, the smaller consumers, the smaller contractors, and also allowing more continuity for cross-border transactions and for people to make it easier for efficient transactions. And in my opinion, the reimagining of the warehouse, which both of us have our own interpretations, which brings it the whole fulfillment cycle and the storage and the depots closer to the end consumer to bring down the cost, something that empowers that ecosystem and that method of facilitating the transaction, that would be super exciting. In so many different interpretations, and that's really what I guess I'm actually looking for in so many companies that we meet today.
I agree with that. I think it's the cross-border game that has a lot of promise, where you can connect, purchasers in Europe or the US with suppliers in Asia, and that way also drive down cost of components. The other company that we're looking for and that we're really excited about, though, is maybe there's a play for warehousing just for the renovation projects. Because in renovation projects, I wouldn't typically need the ultra bulky stuff. I get away with palatable stuff as well as handheld stuff typically. And it's a very exciting and high growth category around multiple markets, India, China, US, Europe nowadays as well. So I think a warehousing game that only focuses on the renovation projects, I see some value in that as well, that I'm excited about.
Yeah.
All right, so Shub, we're coming to the end here of our first episode of Disagreed. We're talking about warehousing today. I think we all conclude that that's an exciting space where we definitely want you as the founders to reach out to us. Reach out to Shub, reach out to myself, reach out to our partners and the entire deal team that you found on our website, foundamental.com. Obviously follow us. Love to hear from you. Drop us a line if you viciously disagree. Drop us a line if you like what you heard, and looking forward to the next episode in a few days here. Thanks a lot for hearing and listening in.
Thank you, everyone.